Oh, hi there, and welcome everybody to the West Midlands Leadership Hustings. I'm David Craddock, I'm chair of the West Midlands Lib Dem Party, and I'd like to welcome Ed and Layla and all of our members to what I hope is going to be a really interesting session. The West Midlands has an economy roughly the size of Scotland. Would you believe it? We have a diverse population of over 6 million, an array of cities, historic market towns and villages in rural communities, which include Birmingham, the second largest city in the UK, and of course Stratford-upon-Avon, the home of Shakespeare. We have a diverse array of service, agriculture and manufacturing industries, and of course, as you possibly know, we are the home of Jaguar Land Rover. In Birmingham and Warwick, we have two of the top 20 universities in the UK. And to top all that, we have more miles of canals than in Venice. The Lib Dem Party regionally is a very vibrant and dynamic party. Our recent Aim High development plan aims to grow our councillor base from 111 to 180 by 2023. We want to achieve at least one MP elected in the 2024 general election and break back into 6 black hole councils. We also want to grow our membership by from 7,000 to 10,000 with the help of our new leader, whoever that might be. So I'm very pleased to hand over to my vice chair, Nuki Proctor, who's going to chair the hustings going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So over the past few weeks, regional members have been submitting their questions, and so today's hustings will be in 3 parts. In the first section, we'll focus on regional and policy questions. In the second section, we'll focus on questions of leadership and party strategy. Then in the final section, we'll be having a final quick fire round to really get to know the candidates. A team of us are on the YouTube chat ready to get your feedback, comments, and potentially supplementary questions. Please engage both there and on Twitter using hashtag WMLibDems. As always, we ask audience members to please be respectful, polite, and constructive. And without further ado, we will start proceedings this evening with a 3-minute opener from each of the candidates. I will be using a trusty bell to indicate when there are 10 seconds remaining, and potentially over the course of the evening to keep the flow of the event really, really nice and dynamic. The coin toss has already determined that Ed will start. And so Ed, if you're ready, happy to hand over to you and let's begin.
Thank you, Nuki. Friends, these are challenging times. With the worst recession for 300 years, COVID, Brexit, the climate emergency, the West Midlands economy is being hit hard. From Jaguar Land Rover to aerospace, job losses are mounting. As leader, I would bring both vision and experience to tackle such challenges. Take the economy and climate. Too often they've been separate. My green economy recovery plan brings them together to invest in green homes, green transport, green energy with a green jobs guarantee. I can deliver this green vision because I've experienced doing it before. I fought the Tories on climate and won. My work in government more than trebled the UK's renewable power. Thanks to us, Britain is the world leader in offshore wind. Be proud. We have the best climate change record of any party and a vision for more. I'm arguing for a partnership with industry to make us world leaders in green vehicles, world leaders in zero carbon flight. But a future greener economy must also be fairer. From my work on a universal basic income, when I was Paddy Ashdown's economics advisor, to devising policies like a penny on income tax for education, I've always argued for progressive ideas to build a fairer society. So post-COVID, let's also campaign on caring. The UK has almost 10 million carers, 3 times as many people who voted for us in the last election. Friends, let's be the voice of carers. My own caring experience started as a young carer. Dad died when I was 4. So when Mum became terminally ill when I was 12, I nursed her for 3 years till she died. Now Emily and I care for our children, including my disabled son John, who needs 24/7 care. So I do understand what so many carers go through every day. My life experience helps me relate to people, to voters, to their challenges. In the general election review, you see our party's many challenges. And the conclusion, there are no quick fixes. And the review's sharpest criticism, people don't know what voting Liberal Democrat means. My vision begins to answer that. A greener, fairer, more caring country. Friends, we can win. I get quality media cut through, like after I forced a commitment from Boris Johnson for an independent inquiry into COVID. And I'm an experienced campaigner. I'm the only MP in our party's history to win without being a target seat. Times are tough for our party. But I joined when we were just 4% in the polls. When at the first nationwide election under Paddy Ashdown's leadership in 1989, we scored less than 6%. But I saw how Paddy led us back. That's what I want to do. So please back me so we can win. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. And over to Layla.
Well, first of all, thank you, David and Yuki. Thank you all at home for watching us instead of the FA Cup final. Now, you may well have already voted for the next leader, but if you haven't, I urge you to seize this moment to change our party's future. And I'm asking for your vote to move our party and our country forward together. But let's be honest about where we are right now. We are languishing at 6% in the polls, down from 12 in the general election. And our council base has halved over the last 10 years. We need to change. But there is a place for bold, liberal ideas in this country. I know this because I've traveled across the UK speaking to voters, and I've since held listening sessions with over 300, that's 3/4 of local parties. Under my leadership, based on these conversations, I'd encourage a renewed Liberal Democrat Party to campaign on policies that actually matter to people, that work for you on the ground, where you're not ashamed of putting national leaflets through people's doors. My plan for our party will allow us to build on the successes of our councillors across the West Midlands and win again at every level, so we can reverse the disastrous record of Labour and the Tories when it comes to delivering essential services and invest in communities that have been far too long ignored by London-centric governments. To advocate a reformed approach to lifelong learning, empowering teachers, but more importantly, getting children world ready, not just exam ready. An ambitious new programme of house building with sustainability at its core, protecting our environment and connecting our rural communities with zero carbon public transport, and providing a basic income so that no one gets left behind. These flow from the 3 pillars of my campaign: education, the environment, and the economy. And by offering solutions which improve people's lives in areas that they care about, we will speak to a broad base of voters and communities again. But we need to be able to communicate our incredible policies. And throughout this campaign, I've proven that I can get that important media cut through. I've appeared on both national and local news, but it's not just about quantity, it's also about quality. From the focus of my cross-party inquiry into coronavirus to calling out our atrocious government's lack of transparency you might have seen on Newsnight last night, we need to take advantage of this and then use it to broadcast a broad, relevant message. It's how I overturned all in one go a 10,000 Tory majority in Oxford West and Abingdon. I built a plan and a vision which gained support from both moderate Conservative voters as well as galvanising parties on the centre left. And we need to do this across the country, to take the fight to both Labour and the Tories locally where they're letting their communities down, and start rebuilding council seat by council seat. We have so many incredible councillors in the West Midlands. Let's elect more. In this leadership election, I'm the candidate who can move us on from the last decade, rebuild trust with the electorate, and power a political comeback. So vote for me and vote for change today. Thank you.
Thank you, Layla. Okay, so we'll dive into the questions and we'll be going to Ed first. And the first question for the evening is from Richard Whelan, who's based in Newcastle under Lyme. Richard says, there has been talk about a northern powerhouse to regenerate the north of England. But what do the candidates think needs to happen here in the West Midlands, particularly in counties such as Staffordshire and Shropshire, to regenerate this part of the country too? So Ed, over to you.
Well, I certainly think we need to have a serious economic strategy for the whole of the West Midlands. And that may be different from county to different parts of the West Midlands. You know, regions aren't homogenous. My background is an economist. I've got a degree in economics and I put myself through night school economics, and I've been involved in economic thinking for the party for 30 years. And I'd be very, very keen to work region by region, county by county, to help you develop the economic strategy, the future thinking that suits you. I like to think, though, that we need to work on a green economy. We've got to think all aspects of our economic and social life has to think about climate change. And I'd like us to think about our buildings. I'd like to think about our transport, our power, our agriculture, and think about how that can help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I think the need to bring together economics and the climate change will be fundamental to any strategy, I think, that Liberal Democrats should be pushing. Now, that may mean, you know, better transport links, public transport. It might mean in rural areas, you know, re-regulating the buses and having green buses. But I'd really like to work with you to work out what you think we should be putting forward. And I'd like to do that ahead of the county council elections if it's Shropshire. I'm delighted to say I've got the backing of Matthew Green from Ludlow, so I've got a link to Shropshire, but you guys may have some ideas. I have a strong record of creating green jobs, particularly in more deprived areas, and I'd like to bring that record, that experience, to help you across the region, so you can have a vision, a practical vision of a green economy.
Sorry, and Layla, your thoughts on what we need to do in the West Midlands?
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Nuki. And first of all, we have to recognise that this is really a difficult period for the country. And it's going to be left behind communities that become even more left behind at times like these. It's also young people. We're facing a 1 in 300 year economic event. And it is right at this time that the government uses money to invest in areas that are going to be worst hit. So I would like to see the Liberal approach. The Liberal approach to this is bottom up and not top down. It empowers local communities and empowers local councils to take this to a degree in their own hands and make sure that they are the ones in the driving seat, so that we can ensure that, you know, anything that might come from more manufacturing losses in Staffordshire, especially the potteries, to young people who are struggling to get on that first rung of the housing ladder, all of them are supported. And throughout this process, actually, we need to build back better. I pulled together voices from across the country before the leadership election started as a way of getting the party to start thinking about these ideas again. And there was a common theme throughout them all, which is that, first of all, a green recovery is the right thing to do. And in fact, studies have shown that it's the best way of helping people to go from industries that might be struggling right now, let's say the tourism and creative industries, of which there's a lot in the West Midlands, into industries that will greenify our economy. So that could be making sure that homes are insulated. That could be tree planting. There's all sorts of different ways. But I also talk about putting well-being at the heart of our economies and recognizing that infrastructure isn't just about building roads. It's also about investing in people. Because if we can invest in people, that is how you're going to drive an economy that is very bottom up. So we cannot have a return to austerity. We cannot have a return to Margaret Thatcher letting communities down in the way that she did. We absolutely have to make the case and lead from the front to protect the most vulnerable, to make sure no one falls through the cracks, and to ensure that any kind of economic recovery is absolutely based on local principles. And I think that that will lead to an economy that's much more balanced, that's much less London and Southeast centric. And I say that as an Oxford MP. We absolutely need to be spreading the wealth across the whole of the United Kingdom. And it makes no sense at all that the West Midlands is left out in the way that it does.
Thank you, Layla. And I think that actually brings us nicely onto the next question that we were hoping to yield, which I think both of you articulated points around the economy and the direction, but obviously coronavirus has had a dramatic impact on, to some extent, how we may have viewed this, you know, as near as this time last year. So I now go to a question from Jenny Wilkinson from Sutton and Erdlington Lib Dems, and I'll start with you, Layla. But she asked, and this may be a controversial topic, with coronavirus accelerating a move towards remote working and an expected significant reduction in business travel, do we need to review the party support for HS2? So Layla first.
Well, first I'll start by recognizing, yes, this is a contentious issue, and I absolutely appreciate that. And yes, we have to encourage remote working. Apart from anything else, we have to encourage flexible working. One of the things that I've been trying to push the government on is making flexible working a right rather than something that you have a right to ask for, which is what it is right now. And the reason why that's so important is that so many families have found that actually this works better for them. Flexible working can mean working at different hours. It can mean being able to better balance your responsibilities at home to the responsibilities to work. It won't work unless we've got decent free childcare there. And I was really proud to help develop the universal free childcare offer that we put forward in the last general election. But travel's a huge part of it. But I want to see greener travel. And the Tories just immediately think about, you know, the economy, how are we going to get people moving again? How are we going to get people back into jobs? And they think roads. That's their top priorities. They think roads. But we know that if we are going to hit, you know, carbon neutral Britain by 2050, and incidentally, our own party's policy is 2045. I think we should go further than that. I think we should be aiming for carbon negative. It just sounds more urgent. It's the right approach. It's like the right feeling towards it. But that rail needs to be a big part of it. And the reason why I continue to support HS2 just about, there's value for money arguments here, there's biodiversity arguments here, but I do, is because it increases capacity across all railways. So that's the spine, but we cannot forget inter-county connectivity. We cannot forget the east-west connections that are so often very missing from our country. And so for now, I remain on the right side of supporting HS2, but nevertheless, I'm persuadable the other way, because what we've seen countless times is that when it's looked under a microscope and there's been a lot of wastage of money, there's been a lot of mismanagement of this project, there comes a point when you're throwing good money after bad. And if we get to that point, then I do think we need to think again as a party.
Thank you, Layla. And Ed, over to you, your views on HS2 in light of the impact of coronavirus.
I think COVID is going to change an awful lot of the way we think about policy, whether it's housing, planning, or indeed transport. I think it's a bit early to say that we should ditch high speed 2, but I think there is absolutely a case for looking at again. And let me explain why. I've supported HS2, I voted for it in Parliament for 2 reasons. First of all, climate change, and secondly, capacity on public transport so we can get freight and people off the roads. The climate change argument was I wanted to see if we could reduce and get rid of almost all domestic flights in the UK, because flying in airplanes are so damaging to the climate. And the best way to do that is to have a whole series of networks, not just HS2, but east to west links, where there is good railway networks. Now, we've seen some evidence in recent years that actually, in fact, in the last year or two, that we may be able to fast track the move to zero carbon flights. We may even be able to think about zero carbon flight coming much earlier. If that's the case, then that does reduce the need for moving from air to train. The other issue is capacity. I've always looked at the numbers. the growing number of people on our railways suggests that we are running out of capacity. And that was the other reason I supported it. Now, of course, if people are not using the trains because of COVID, if people are traveling less because they're working from home, they're communicating over video conferencing, whether it's Zoom or another platform, then maybe we'll need to look at that again. And maybe we'll spend the money not on HS2, but on other links, suburban links, so people can travel in and around their regions rather than longer distances. So I'm not trying to avoid the question, I'm just showing that things have changed dramatically. We don't quite know the issues, but the two things that I would judge it on would be, do we need to replace domestic flights for climate change? And do we need that extra capacity? Is passenger traffic still going up and up and up? And when we should look at that, and COVID is the moment when we do review it.
Thank you. Staying on the theme of coronavirus, I now move to a question from David Nichol, based in Bromsgrove. And David asks, we are facing the biggest health and economic crisis in the last century. This week, BBC Hereford and Worcester reported that although 40% of people think the Conservative government has handled the COVID-19 pandemic badly, that compares to 36% who think it's been handled well. What will you do as leader to respond to this, given that the West Midlands has been one of the hardest hit areas, and yet still the Liberal Democrats are polling at around 6%? And we'll start with Ed.
Well, on the latter point, it's not surprising. We had a very bad election result. We've had the pandemic. You know, I joined the party at 4%. Paddy Ashdown was a fantastic leader, but a year into his leadership, we scored less than 6% at the first nationwide election as leadership. So that's not that surprising. But the question is, have you the capability to campaign and build it up? And I believe I absolutely have. And I think I've shown that on the COVID question. Not only have I led on issues like self-employed, the job retention scheme, a whole range of economic issues where we have actually set the pace. I've also set the pace on the biggest issue of the day, namely the need to hold this government account for its shambolic handling of COVID. The failure to prepare, the failure to get the PPE, the testing, the tracing and testing, and their appalling negligence, possibly even criminal negligence, on the way they treated the care homes and the staff. And to do that, to hold them to account, I was the first politician, the first party leader to ask for an independent public inquiry. And I kept asking in the media, in Parliament, questioning. And then I managed to trap the Prime Minister's questions. So in answer to my question, he made the first commitment to a future public inquiry. And that made massive news, and we got huge coverage as a result of that. And I'm keen that we own that issue, and the work that Layla's doing will help us own that issue too. And by owning that issue of the inquiry, we can show that we are the party that asked the questions, that won that early battle to hold this appalling government to account. And I've already written to the Prime Minister to ask him to ensure that the inquiry is held under the 2005 Inquiries Act. That's really important, because if any inquiry that's not held under that act is going to be much weaker, very, very weak, because he won't have the powers to call people and papers. I've proposed, in consultation with lawyers, including lawyers representing the bereaved families, the terms of reference for the inquiry following the 2005 Act's stipulations. I've even proposed a possible chair, a guy called Martin Ford QC, who led the work on Windrush, who led the work on anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. So I think that we need to champion that. And so, Dave, I think you and all Liberal Democrat campaigners across the country will be able to point to Liberal Democrat leadership on this issue over the next few months and years. And as it becomes ever clearer, not just to the 40% who were disappointed, but to a larger number, then we can get the credit. And we just got to keep banging on this, as I have done and as I have managed to achieve. And I'm delighted when the Guardian editorial, the newspaper editorial, gave me the credit as the person who's led on this. So we can get credit for it. We can cut through. We just got to keep on determined. And then I think we will turn around our fortunes, Dave.
Thank you. And over to Layla.
Well, David, thank you for your question. And I'm really, really worried about this. I mean, on the one hand, we're seeing what Boris Johnson is doing, or more to the point, not doing very often. The last week itself has been an utter shambles, with not any clarity of message, with no overarching strategy from the government. And if it's the David I'm thinking of, if you're on the front line of the NHS, you'll be seeing it from your own eyes about how we've got operations that are now in huge backlog, how people are worried about the potential for a second wave at a time when we haven't even got on top of the first one. And so holding Boris Johnson to account about this, frankly, isn't political. It's the right thing to do, because if we can do that, if we can show people, if we can put the government under pressure, then maybe, just maybe, we can help to save lives. And at a time like this, I've always tried to be non-tribal, to be as collaborative as possible, because there are bigger things at stake here right now. So we have been calling for an inquiry. My concern was that it would be at some point in the future, and that we wouldn't learn the lessons in time to be able to make significant change in time for a second wave. And so we put together a group. There's an all-party parliamentary group. We've got nearly 70 MPs on board, including some quite prominent backbench Conservative MPs. That's really important to get that buy-in from the backbenchers on the Tory government too. And what we're looking at is thousands of pieces of evidence. We had our first evidence session last Wednesday. We have another one next week. Last week, we really dived into what is that overall government strategy. And what was clear that was coming out from the evidence is that actually we aren't aiming low enough in terms of elimination. We want to eliminate COVID-19 transmission from our communities. That helps both people, but it also helps the economy. It's what Scotland is already proposing. It's what de facto has happened in Wales. And we should be aiming for that in England too. We're also going to be looking at bereaved families, the mental health support given to frontline workers, those who are suffering from the long-lasting effects of COVID, and we are going to be working all through the summer. There is absolutely no time to waste, because at the end of the day, we have to hold this government to account. And when we do this properly, when people can see that we as Lib Dems have their best interests at heart, that we will work with anyone to do what's best for them and their family, I'm sure that that will give us credit in the eyes of the voters. So we have to do this. We have to do it for our communities. We have to do it for our residents, because it's the right thing to do. And hopefully change government strategy before a second wave. And at the very last Prime Minister's questions of this Parliament, I told Boris Johnson about this, asked him if he'd look at our recommendations, and he said that he would. And we all know, yes, with a grain of salt what he says, but at least he recognises that this is important, and he replied positively. So let's hope we can change government strategy for the better.
Thank you, Layla. Now I'll move on to the next question, which we try to get through as many of these as we can. And so the next question is from Helen Morgan from the North Shropshire Lib Dems. And she asks, we have in recent years lost ground in rural areas such as the South West and East Wales, which used to be considered our safest seats. What is your strategy to win those back? And we'll start with Layla.
Thank you. Well, yes, that's absolutely empirically true. And that's why when the 2019 general election happened, I had a guess, you know, what it was. We were hearing Revoke was going down like a, quote, bag of sick on the door. That was from a Devon activist who told me that. But I wanted to go and speak to voters myself, to understand and listen to them, because we have to admit that we have not been getting this right. So I went to places like Leeds and Sheffield, I went to Kent, but then I went to Devon, Cornwall, and I went to Wales as well. And I was talking to people there and asking them a very simple question, which is, what do you think of us as Liberal Democrats, and what would make you vote for us again? And I have to tell you that it was a pretty damning indictment on the party. Actually, they loved their local councillors. This is why building back from the ground up is so important, because they loved their local councillors where they had councils. They loved their councils. but they really did not like the National Party. In Tory-facing areas, it was primarily about revoke, and that was also to do with Brexit. And they could just about stomach the People's Vote campaign, which I helped to launch, in fact, in the last Parliament. And we were working cross-party, and people could understand that, give them the final say. They got that. But the problem with revoke, it was so top-down. And yet we're a party that talks about being bottom-up, and we absolutely lost trust with those voters. The same applied in Wales. In the Labour-facing areas, actually coalition came up as the primary reason why people had lost trust with the party. And so that's my diagnosis about how we are going to win people back. We need to move on, but we need to understand what's been going wrong. We need to start by listening to voters. That's a key part of my leadership style. I'm very collaborative. I listen to people, and I think we need to spend a good amount of time listening to voters again. And then from that, with that information, build a message that is broad enough to appeal to both Labour and Conservative areas, but also to make people see what we are for as Lib Dems again. You know, this is about freedom. It's about freedom to the individual. It's about freedom to communities. And when I speak to people in all parts of the UK, they get that, but they just don't associate that with us. And in our rural areas, and I've got some in Oxford, West and Abingdon, I've got farms and I've got villages that don't have bus services and don't have good broadband. And actually it's a big part of my life is fighting for them. We can show them that we are on their side, and boy, do they need someone on their side right now. We've got, you know, an economy that's tanking. We've got a potential no deal Brexit on the horizon. That's going to hurt farmers. That's going to hurt those rural communities. Even if they didn't vote for us, we need to be there to stand up for them.
Thank you, Layla. And Ed, how do we win back the rural areas that used to be our safest seats?
Helen, thank you for your question. This is one of the issues that has obsessed me since the last election, indeed before. When I became acting leader after Joe lost his seat, I co-commissioned the general election review, and it was my idea that we got Dorothy Thornhill to chair it because she's such a great campaigner and she calls a spade a spade. And I ensured that the remit of the review, which didn't just look at 2019, because I felt for a long time that our campaigning was going wrong, that it was too top down and not bottom up. And so the first answer to your question, Helen, is in the general election review. 61 pages, many recommendations. It's a tough read. It says there's no quick fix. It shows that there's a lot of problems, and one of the key problems is that we've not been focusing on local campaigns, that it has been very much from LDHQ sending literature that wasn't wanted, wasn't helping in local areas. And I think we need to trust our regions more. We need to trust our local parties more, do more training and not be top down, but be bottom up. That's what the general election review says. Do read it, because if I'm leader, I'll be implementing that. I think it is a very good mandate for change in the party. One of the things it does say, which is another thing that's obsessed me, is the need to make sure people know who the Liberal Democrats are. And one of the problems at the last election, particularly last election, when we just focused on stop Brexit, anti-Brexit though we all are, we failed to get over the other issues that Liberal Democrats care about. Indeed, at the last leadership election, I talked about the need to reach out to Leave voters, to reach out to Leave communities, because I know we represented many of them in our areas, and we were failing them because we weren't talking about their issues. We were talking about a subject, particularly when we went to revoke, that was designed to stop them voting for us. It was a huge political mistake, as the general election review shows. And what I want to do as leader, I'm going to start with the voters. I want local parties and regions to start with their voters, listen to them. And in developing my platform for this election, I've been looking at the opinion polls, looking at Liberal Democrat voters, and they're saying it is about jobs and the economy. Of course it is now. They're saying it is about climate change. It is about fairness and education. It is about, you know, caring for people in the NHS. And I put together my platform thinking about what the voters are saying. We've got to be more relevant to them, and we've got to hone down on, you know, I would say 3 messages max: a greener economy, fairer society, more caring country. That's my start for 10. And then we've got to repeat them with huge discipline. You know, media for media's sake, just going all over the shop, doesn't work. I've seen it over 30 years in this party, 20 years in Parliament. You've got to have message discipline. And so I'm telling you that to win, not only do we have to implement the general election review for the party machinery, under me, we would have that message discipline. I would insist upon it. We'd work as a party to make sure that branding was there, that it was, you know, whether it's my idea of a green economy, fairer society, more caring country, or something else. But when we agreed that, we'd work that through, and then local parties would work with that, with their how those messages work for them. That's the way we've campaigned and won in the past. Let's get back to those winning ways.
Thank you, Ed. So moving away from domestic policy, I'm going to move on to a question from John Kelly, based in Warwick and Leamington. And he asks, do the candidates feel the party gives sufficient attention to foreign policy, given our lofty values about internationalism? At the moment, it's only half the brief for one MP, whereas domestic issues are spread among the rest of the MPs. As leader, would you give a higher priority to foreign affairs? And we'll start with Ed.
Well, I think you have to, because actually for me, foreign affairs is about climate change. Foreign affairs to me is about a fairer world. Foreign affairs to me is about how we keep the peace. So when I think about foreign affairs, having negotiated the EU on climate change, having led the British delegation to the United Nations at 3 separate climate talks, I know you have to work with other countries if we're going to save our planet. And so that, to me, is what international foreign policy is all about. And if you want a fairer society, you want a fairer world, right? And, we've got to make sure that we are doing our part on developing aid. The decision by the Tory government to merge DFID with the Foreign Office is a disastrous decision. We should be making sure that the money we spend on aid is only about reducing poverty, not about some other diplomatic issue that the Foreign Office has. And we need to oppose that. So, a fairer world is what we need to be pushing for in foreign policy, along with human rights, by the way. I'm very passionate about LGBT plus issues, and I think we need to campaign internationally for the rights of LGBT plus communities. And you know what? The world is a scary place at the moment. The rise of nationalism, populism, it really worries me. We've seen that with Brexiteers, we see it with Trump, we see it with Bolsonaro in Brazil. And the really big threat, the geopolitical threat in our world, is the tension and potentially rising tension between China and the United States. If you look over human history, when one superpower is going down and another superpower is coming up, and that's what's happening, then too often that ends in war. I'm not trying to be a scaremonger here, but we have to play a part in this very difficult foreign policy situation, this tension which Trump personifies, and President Xi is no better with the human rights abuses and the way he's given absolute power to himself. So I want the Liberal Democrats to be at that international stage, to be worrying about climate change, worrying about development, and worrying about peace, and working with our partners, primarily in Europe, actually. It's mad that we're leaving the EU. Working with our European partners to play our role to keep the peace and manage as best we can this tension between the United States and China.
Thank you, Ed. And over to Layla.
Thank you, John. And the question was, should we be spending more attention on it? And I would say that, we have to be very mindful of it. We absolutely need to be engaging with it. But I do think that Alistair Carmichael has been doing a really fantastic job in his role. And I do think that Wendy Chamberlain has also been doing a fantastic job in her role covering international development. But there is always space in our modern political discourse to be talking about those international issues. But let's start with, well, actually, why does it matter to me? Well, this is how I came into politics in the first place. My mother is Palestinian. My father grew up in Manchester, went to university in Stoke, actually, went to Kiel, and then moved abroad when I was 1 to Brussels, where he joined the European Commission. And we started moving around the world. I went to Ethiopia, to Jamaica, to Jordan. And along the way, actually wasn't that interested in British politics, was more interested in physics myself. But the way that the international world interplayed with each other. We'd sit there around the dinner tables discussing, what America had done recently, what is the place of the European Union, trade and aid, and the spreading of peace around the world. And public service was a key value that was driven into me as a child. Then I became a teacher and got into politics. And I realized that the fundamental principles that I had been discussing with my family, or even discussing as part of education, are liberal principles. It's about collaborating and working with others. It is the thread that links through all of our policies, which is that the way that we, as a planet, as a nation, as a community, are going to solve the problems that we face in front of us is to work together. And that was why we wanted to be part of the European Union. That's why we believe in the international rule-based order. That's why we stand up for minority and discriminated against groups across the world. It all lies in values of social justice and human rights. And the reason why we have those values and the reasons why we care is because we are liberals. And I think it's no coincidence that if you look in the past at when our party has done particularly well, whether it be, Paddy Ashdown in Hong Kong or Charles Kennedy in Iraq, the first time I ever really took notice of the Lib Dems was in that period. It was the first march I ever went on, was when we were talking about international issues, because by the clear stance that we took on them, people could see our underlying values and they understood what we were for. So yes, we should continue to play our full part wherever we see discrimination, wherever we see poverty, wherever we see injustice, anywhere in the world, we should be fighting it. But we draw it back through that core line, that core principle, then it leads right back to our hearts of why we are liberals in the first place.
Thank you, Layla. Now, before we move on to section 2, where we're going to be focusing more on leadership questions, I'm just very quickly going to hand over to my Deputy Chair, Jennifer Gray, to have a bit of a pulse check on any of the comments and tweets that are coming through so far. So over to Jennifer.
Thank you, Nuki. Yeah, it's been quite exciting keeping up with it all, I have to say. So both candidates will be glad to know that there was praise for excellent opening statements from a number of people. And you'll also be glad to know there are a number of people who are yet to decide. So they're all making their decisions now. It's all very exciting. And then it got excited. Yes, needing more powers at local level is something that was popular, not surprisingly, in this region. A good quote here: "We used to be the party of devolution." That came from Mark. I thought that was an interesting one to pick up on. Moving on to support in favour of HS2. So that, I'm not surprised that was a hot potato here. Now, there is plenty of support for HS2, with people thinking that increased capacity is important, high-speed rail is important, lots of people talking about the economic boost to Birmingham. The cons, it's certainly not popular in Warwickshire. Investment in rail infrastructure is, that's seen as a very important thing, and people are questioning the affordability. And in terms of environmental concerns, they fall into the positive and negative categories there too. Moving on to revoke, people acknowledging that was an issue during the last election. An interesting point from Laura in Solihull: LDHQ need to trust us more in the West Midlands. Yes, certainly I think the point about having less people on the federal board, in line with the Thornhill report, has generally been popular, but Jack Worrell has posted some very good follow-up questions to that, which is, well, that's all very well and good, but how do we do it then? So interesting comments from people. Thank you.
And a perfect one to end on, because the first question that we will be asking in the second section will be in relation to the Thornhill review. And so just in case you may have lost track, we'll be starting with Layla. And the first question will be, was given submitted by Phil Benyon, our former West Midlands MEP, and he asked, the Thornhill review made recommendations in 2 important areas: the level and distribution of party resource devoted to building strength and winning elections at all levels, and 2, a thorough review of the organisation and governance of the party. What changes will you seek to drive through in order to make the party machine more effective and to deliver a step change in electoral success over the next decade?
Well, thank you, Phil. And first of all, just to absolutely make clear, because I think it's really important, and Ed's already said it, and I should say it too, the recommendations need to be implemented in time for the next general election. And whoever wins, I hope, will then use this opportunity to take that as the mandate to drive that. I've released a 5-point plan that is part of my thinking of what I think we need to do. And it starts with, listening to voters, but it also starts with listening to activists too. I've decided that I, come what may, will have a position in my office that is dedicated to making sure that we've got that direct link into my office with campaigners on the ground, so that there isn't this bizarre situation where you only have 2 set piece times in the whole year to hold your leader to account at conference. Actually, Zoom and coronavirus has kind of shown us that this is much more possible now. And it's really also important for the leader and the top team to be able to understand what's going on. But we have to also recognize that support to local parties and to trust local parties is really important. I want to see a mass program of retraining and support given to local parties, whether they are ones who are, on their way to taking a council, or if they are a party that doesn't have even their first councillor. I want to make sure that you have the resource that you need to be able to do that. And that's going to take money, that's going to take resource, but it's vital, because if we don't do this, I don't want to be a leader for a few years and then we get to the next general election just focusing on Westminster seats. And, there's a big debate right now about, Labour versus the Conservatives, and what do we do with those seats where primarily it's against the Conservatives that we're going to win them, and all of that. And maybe we'll come to that. But I want us to build to the election after that too, which is going to include parts of the country that we haven't been that strong in recently. So it all starts with making sure that there is a education program. I'm a teacher. It's unsurprising that I would focus on that. But the reason why I do is because that's us living our values. It's us saying that it needs to be bottom up, that we trust you, and that you get to feed in and be genuinely part of the process. I think one of the phrases that's been associated with the review, perhaps not used in it, is basically we have a faux democracy in the Liberal Democrats. We talk the talk, but we don't walk the walk. It's time that changed. And that is what I would absolutely focus on. And the second bit that I would focus on is that message. And I spoke about that earlier. So that's about listening to voters, recognizing that we haven't got it right, and spending the time that we've got. And the big thing that we've got on our side is that, much as I don't like this government, I do think that they will be in place until 2024. And so we have 3.5 odd years that we can spend at least the first year of really listening to people on the ground, really getting under the skin, so that I as leader and others and those on the ground can develop that sixth sense about what's going to work, what works. Start with them. That has to be the key.
Thank you, Layla.
If we do that, then we can build our support and have a message that works as well. Thank you.
And over to Ed.
Well, Phil, thank you for your question. I think in your first part, you wanted to know about the distribution of resources to local parties and to regions. I absolutely think it needs to go down. The National Party has not spent money wisely. In the last election, it spent £6 million on nationally produced leaflets delivered by the Royal Mail, which in many areas, frankly, did not help us. I'll tell you what, in my own area, I won by over 10,000 votes, yes. But when I saw a national leaflet, I despaired. We spent money and effort getting our leaflets exactly right. And then we delivered them, we paid for them, and the National Party wasted all that money producing leaflets, which then landed on top of ours and weren't as good as ours. That's why we need a bottom-up approach to campaigning. It's why, I remember when we used to win a lot of elections, and we used to train local campaigners who would take national messages, but then localize them. That's how we used to do it, my friends. We'll do it again. The review shows the way. I'm determined to push it because that's how I used to win. And I found the National Party getting in the way. Second part of the question from Phil was all the organisation governance changes. I think there's some really good ideas there. And I think, if we'd had proper governance, would we have chosen, I'm sorry to be controversial, Warwick and Leamington Spa to be a target seat here in the West Midlands last time? I mean, I personally thought it was crazy. It was a Labour Tory marginal. I just didn't see why, based on one poll, that we should have done that. There were other seats, Stratford upon Avon, for example, with our amazing candidate Dominic. That would have been a better target in my view. And I think we could have used that money that was spent in Warwick and Leamington Spa across the region, building up our local government base, building our prospects for the next election. But it was a bad decision nationally. So, let's get through those governance reforms. Yes, the federal executive absolutely has to be cut. Jack asked the question, how? Well, it will be up to the federal board and then, of course, to conference. We're a democratic party. And, it's not just up to the leader. I wouldn't want all that powers. We're a democratic party. The federal board's already started that. As acting leader, I have done two things. I went to the Federal Policy Committee to make sure that we are thinking about involving more members in policy debates. And they've taken the platform that I suggested called Policy Lab. And Policy Lab is an online platform especially designed for groups around the country to debate with each other, communities to debate with each other. And I think it will empower you as members to have a greater say in policy and to put forward your ideas and debate with those. I'm quite excited about this Policy Lab. If you've not seen it, go check it out. I'm really proud of having delivered that and pushed that forward. And then, Zoom. If we're going to make sure that we're not a London-centric party, that all parts of the party members can play a part, Zoom has given us that answer. Now, I don't want there to be any committee meeting of the party where you actually have to attend in person. Let's make it obligatory so that people who, wherever they live in the country, can be part of those committees, not just if you're living in London. So, okay. I'm committed to the changes.
And Ed, just because I do want to spend a little bit of time on that, because we have had viewers comment specifically on the Thornhill review that I would like to reflect. One of the specific questions that have come back, and if we can try and keep this brief and then we'll rattle through some other questions, is how you might deal with resistance to implementing the recommendations in the Thornhill review. So in a few sentences, what would be your approach to dealing with resistance?
Well, first of all, you have to persuade. We are a democratic party. You have to make the arguments. The fact that the Thornhill review has been widely acclaimed, Layla and I both support it. It's got support across the federal board. That hopefully will reduce the resistance. And I hope people who see the resistance will realise that we just can't go on as we've been, my friends. We've got to have some radical change. Some of us have been saying this for a long time. I've been frustrated for a long time about the way things have gone on LDHQ. And we have to change. And the great thing about the Thornhill review, Dorothy won the mayoralty in Watford when we had not a really good record there 4 times. She passed it on to another Liberal Democrat. She knows what she's doing. The panel was full of people who knew what they're doing. Let's implement it. And I will lead the persuasion so we do get it implemented.
And Layla, same to you. Specifically on the topic of resistance, how would you tackle any resistance to implementation of the Thornhill review?
Well, it won't be me that tackles it alone. And there's a reason why in my slogan, Move Forward Together, the word together is there. We have to do this together. And we have to recognize that this is something, and the review actually makes this very clear, that there is a very specific role for the leader, the CEO and the president, but also we've got our party bodies, and that ultimately the member is king. We are one member, one vote. And it all starts with making that case for change. And where there are pockets of resistance, actually resistance, the way the question's phrased is suggesting that resistance is a bad thing. Actually, resistance can sometimes lead to better decision making. Maybe that resistance is because there's something that we hadn't quite thought about. There's a group that we hadn't quite appreciated as feeling that they'd been left out of this, and actually listening about why there are people resisting is a really important first start. I think having someone in my own office that is very much focused, I spoke about that role, very much focused on the internal workings of the party, making sure that, there is that quick flow of information from what's happening at the grassroots through to committees, through to the leader's office via HQ, changing the ethos of the party that has been so sort of top down and and stifling almost to one where it's genuinely bottom up. If we can get to that point, then we are going to be in a really good place. The job of the leader is to help to ease some of that, to put their political weight behind the broad thrust for change, but to also, let's not just dismiss people who want to offer a different opinion.
Thank you.
Make sure they're included.
Okay, so again, we're going to go for a slight change in tone, and so question that I would like to ask next has been submitted by, again, Jenny from Sutton and Erdlington Lib Dems. Having seen Tim being questioned about LGBTQ+ issues and Jo being grilled about her voting record in coalition as leaders, what is the issue you are most vulnerable to being challenged on by the media, and how will you answer those challenges? And as we did, the follow-up started with Ed and then went to Layla. We'll carry that through, and so we'll start with Layla and then we'll move to Ed.
Thank you, Jenny. Well, I think that media scrutiny is a part of whoever is going to be leader. And you don't put yourself up for a role like this unless you are absolutely clear that you can take it. And just over the last 3 years that I've been an MP, all sorts have come up: my former relationships, my current relationship, my sexuality, my depression. When I was a university student, I've spoken out about my obesity and the battle that I won against obesity. So those parts of your life do get sort of trawled over. But what I've also noticed is when there's a difficult question, actually the bit where politicians go wrong is when they often can't answer the question. And I've been asked about all of these things in the context of this leadership election. And I answer the question and then they move on because there's openness there. And people can appreciate that you are being transparent with them about yourself and about your background and about whatever issue it is. And that openness and transparency is the way that I deal with the media. It's one of the reasons why I get media cut through, because they know that they're not going to get that boring politician answer that you can get from anyone, that I am actually going to answer the question, that I'm going to take it head on, that actually it will be conversational, and that through that, you build trust with the people who are watching, you build trust with the people who are hearing you answer those questions, because they recognize that you're doing politics in a different way. And I spent years watching Newsnight, watching Question Time, watching all these programs going, just answer the question. You know, it was such a huge frustration. And I just never understood why people didn't. So I've decided to do it in a different way. And I think it's working. And
Ed, same to you.
Well, I guess it may well be the same as Jo, because I was a minister in the coalition for 5 years and the cabinet minister for 3 years on energy and climate change. And while I think by 2024, I think the coalition issue will be, probably not even mentioned. It wasn't actually mentioned in Kingston in 2019. And I also think with a different Labour Party, the Labour activists won't be focusing in on it as they were under, Corbyn momentum. And frankly, any leader of the Liberal Democrats will be asked their view of the coalition. But, I was in it. And so people may focus in on my role. And I like to think I've got the best answer for it, because I'm really proud of the role that I took under the coalition. I nearly quadrupled renewable power. I signed off more onshore wind, offshore wind, solar farms than any British politician in history. We got the cost of offshore wind down from £160 per unit of power to less than 40 with the policies that I implemented. We're seeing coal come off the system. We've got one of the best records on greening our electricity system. And I'm really proud of that. So if I'm asked by the interview about coalition, I won't do what Jo did. I think, I'm a big fan of Jo's, work with her loyally, but I think she answered that question wrong. I would talk about the positives. And not only that, I would use my record in coalition to talk about the amazing work we did on climate change. And I'd say, look, that's what you get if you vote Liberal Democrat. And at this election in 2024, we've got a vision for a green economy. We want to do even more on renewables, even more on offshore wind. And we want to, do green homes and green transport and green flight and rewilding nature. And so although people out there, some people have said it's a tough question for me to answer, I think it's an easy question for me to answer. In fact, I think I've got a better answer than anyone, because of that record on climate change and how it relates to our future vision. So although people think it's a toughie, I'm looking for, I don't think they'll actually ask it, but if they do, I'm on the money.
Thank you, Ed. So I've had some questions that we have combined, one from Raina within the Cannock Chase Lib Dems and another from Robert from the Wyre Forest Lib Dems. So how do you propose to do a better job of getting the Lib Dem message across at the next general election? And to what extent do you see electoral arrangements with other progressive parties playing a role in this? And so to Ed first, please.
Well, the leader has to go on the TV and the radio, and I've had 20 years experience of that. You know, I've done question times and any questions countless times, Today program, Newsnight. You know, I've done the John Humphreys and Jeremy Paxman's. You know, I've done the Andrew Neils, the Sophie Ridges, the Kathy Newmans. You know, and you at least you'll know with me, someone who's been there at a general election, had the grilling, and really put the message over strongly, and not being caught out. So, you know, I think I bring to the leadership that 20 years experience against the toughest interviewers that there are there around. And as I said earlier, I would bring to the wider party, including what I say, what my team says, message discipline. It is critical. And we don't see this enough in our party. If we want to get through and use the moments that we get on the TV and on the radio, we have to keep saying the same message. Repetition might be boring for party members, but for the voters, it's critical. So that's what I do. You also talked, I think, and Nuki, remind me, tell me if I'm wrong, about relationships with other parties. Is that,
yes.
Yeah?
Correct.
Well, first of all, on the Tories, no way. You know, they've gone very right wing. They're anti-European. I can't stand Boris Johnson and the people. The Tory party has really changed dramatically. We should have nothing to do with them, nothing at all. We are an anti-conservative party. I fought the Tories all my life, and I want us to continue to do that. And if you look at the seats that we can prosper, they're against the Tories. So therefore, is there a chance of some sort of relationship with the Labour Party? Well, yes. What form that will take? Well, I don't think it will shake. I don't think it should take the form of a pact or a deal where we stand down. That wouldn't work. I think it would create a stick the Tories would use to beat us with. And if you look at our voters, half of them, their second preference is a Conservative Party. So this idea that some people have that you can switch our votes to the Labour Party is just not true. It doesn't bear out. And therefore, I want an understanding. The way that I saw Paddy and Tony Blair manage that before '97. And it will be choreography, it'll be difficult, it'll be informal, below the radar. But that's what I do using my experience and having seen Paddy do it to enable that understanding, to enable us to beat the first past the post, to get the tactical voting and to win lots of seats.
And Ed, just because of that, I might bring in, and again, if a short answer on this, and then I'll go over to Layla and we'll combine it. But Dominic from Stratford did say, would you make electoral reform a red line in any confidence and supply or coalition agreement? And would you push for it to be passed without a public referendum? So on that note, you referenced electoral reform and coalition arrangements. What would you say to Dominic?
Dominic, it's a great question, but I am not actually going to give you a straight answer for the simple reason is that I've done a lot of negotiating in my life, negotiating in government, in business, at the EU, at the United Nations. And what you don't do is you don't show your hand. What I will tell you, Dominic, and everybody on this call, is I am utterly committed to winning electoral reform. The best way to do it is actually persuade the Labour Party ahead of the next election to put it in their manifesto and to put it there as the first Queen's speech priority without a referendum. So we don't even have to negotiate it. And I think there's a chance that we could do that. And as leader, working behind the scenes, doing things that I wouldn't necessarily put in the public domain, my objective would be to get that in Labour's manifesto so that any deal is a lot easier. And it doesn't have to be a red line on that. It could be a red line on climate change, a red line for money for the West Midlands. So
Layla, just to refresh, because to refresh, So the question originally, how do you propose to do a better job of getting the Lib Dem message across at the next general election? And to what extent do you see electoral arrangements with other progressive parties playing a role with this? And I'll let you answer this first, and then we'll have the follow-up about the red line and electoral reform.
Thank you, Nikki. So on the media, yes, I've done all of those big shows as well. And just in the last few months, I've had over 300 and more positive appearances, but it's not just about the political pages. I think if we are going to broaden our base of support, we talk quite often about core vote strategy. I've talked a lot about winning back the young vote. We also need to appeal to voters in platforms that they maybe don't normally see politicians. I mean, okay, Have I Got News for You is possibly one of them, although it's quite political. But I've been doing stuff with NME, for example, about the creative industry. We have to actually branch out. And social media is a huge part of that too. Getting creative with social media, making sure that we are absolutely nailing it on social media is a huge part of where I think we need to go as a party, so that we can connect to voters where they are and not just assume that they're all interested in the Guardian pages and that they're looking at that, as important as getting on front pages and being in papers may well be. To the how do you get cut through differently at the last election? Well, also the other thing I would want to do is to build on that wider team. I think one of the things that people did comment on, and I agreed on, was that we had a really talented front bench. And yes, we may only be 11, but we have extraordinary talent in our party, not just in the House of Commons, but also in the House of Lords, also in council leaders. And having that cut through and giving people that training and support so that they can be part of this wider message to help broadcast it, I think is equally important. To what do we do with other parties? Well, this is very much a horses for courses situation. I think Unite to Remain, I'm not sure I'd want to go back there again. Not least because it was very top down. And there were parties that were completely demoralized, being told on the one hand that they were, top target seats, people were going to stand down for you, and then that got dropped, or that they were being asked to stand down for some other party somewhere else in the country, but neither really worked. And what does work is something actually a bit more organic, something a bit more close to our own values, which is working with other parties on the ground where it suits us and it also suits them. And it's very much following that model from Oxford West and Abingdon, if it can be achieved, where I got the Greens to stand aside, and I say aside, not down, because actually what ended up happening is that after a hustings like this, which by the way, your questions are lovely compared to theirs, they absolutely took it to me. And at the end of it, I was convinced I'd fluffed it, but no, they voted 100% to do this. And then they started campaigning with me. And that sent a really powerful signal to activists in the Labour Party who started doing the same. And the voters galvanized around the Lib Dem candidate, which then pulled over moderate Conservative voters. And in those seats where we are second place to the Tories, and if we start now, I reckon we could actually build that trust, and we can start with next year's local elections. A lot of the same areas are Tory facing in local elections. We can start to build this kind of movement on the ground, really bottom up, really organic. It's not going to work everywhere. And two, what happens with coalitions and supplying confidence, whatever, we're going to have to see. I also have ruled out anything with the Tories. Boris Johnson and his party have gone way right. And, I don't think that's the right thing at all. With the Labour Party, I'm impressed with Keir Starmer. I think he's certainly moving the party a bit more to the centre. There's a lot of common policy platforms that I think we should be campaigning on. Electoral reform is certainly one, if we can get the Labour Party there. There's many, many others. And I think we'll just have to wait and see and hope that he totally converts that party into something else that's different. But we've got a long way to go between now and the next 4 years.
Thank you, Layla. Okay, we do have our next section coming up. I want to try and get one more question in, so I would really appreciate really specific direct answers to this one. But Izzy, based in Birmingham, asked, how do the respective potential leaders seek to engage young Lib Dems and young people in policy making? So we'll start with Layla.
Well, I've said just now, this is a core part of what I think we need to do. If we're going to build our core vote over the next 10, 15, 20 years and be really, prominent in politics again, then I think it has to start with young people. And if you look back at the times when we as a party were doing really well, it was when we could offer that hopeful, bold, progressive vision for the country. And that brings young people on board. They can see that on the big issues of the day, top of that list, by the way, I think is climate change. And we saw it with the Fridays for Future strikes. We saw the way that young people have been totally, driving this agenda. It's the opposite of what people would normally associate with young people, who are seen often as sort of, they're a bit apathetic, they don't go to vote, they don't show up in the polls. When it came to the environment, they led the way. And after big strikes in Oxford, I went away saying I was going to do this for them. And I called the first debate on the floor of the House in 2.5 years. I worked cross-party to get Greta Thunberg to Parliament. She held parliamentarians to account, and actually more importantly held Michael Gove to account, which was a sight to behold. It was a wonderful thing. And to capture their hearts, I think we can bring them back. But we need to do more than that as just a party. When I talk about, carbon negative, not just carbon neutral, it's with them in mind. But I also talk about a young person citizens assembly, because it is young people that are going to have to drive through these policy agendas. And the last question, just very quickly, is that very often at conference, young people's voices are missing. And I do think that there is space for a dedicated space at conference for young people.
Thank you. And to Ed, same question.
Izzy, thanks for your question. I think it's both about issues, but it's also about how we organise ourselves. And issues, of course, climate change is a massive issue for young people. Brexit was a massive issue for young people. But I do find in my own constituency, you do need to listen to young people, because, different young people have different views in different parts of the country at different times. This will be my 25th year of going to Kingston University Freshers' Fair. Issues have changed over the years. At the moment, when I go to schools and colleges and talk to people who've graduated in their first jobs, the biggest issue locally is housing, how unaffordable it is, the rent levels, whether you can find any housing. I increasingly think over the next few years, my guess is jobs is going to be a massive issue. Locally, one of the issues in the last 2 years have been knife crime. So, we can think about what the issues are, and we can think climate change and Brexit and so on, but we also need to listen to make sure we really are in touch. We're picking up the issues across the country, but also in the areas where we're campaigning, be it for council seats, be it for constituency. But also how we do this, how we find place in our party, whether it's for the Young Liberals or whether it's for conferences Lena was talking about. I would sort of focus on what I've done with the teams here in Kingston. We built lots of teams up, and we've got a lot of young people in the party, a lot of young people, including from Black and ethnic minority communities in the party. So I've reached out to the many diverse populations here, be they Tamils from Sri Lanka, the Gujaratis, the Koreans, the Muslims from Pakistan, from Iraq, from Iran, Syria. We have a mosque, we have a Gurdwara. We're a very diverse constituency that I represent, and I've been working with the different communities for 20 years and getting people to join the party and then stand for election. And often it's been younger people in those communities that have come forward. So when we're thinking about young people, we need to think really across the board. We really need to think about how we as a party are really listening. And in Birmingham, across the whole West Midlands, you will have different groups of young people with different interests, with different ways that we communicate them. Let me just end on this one, the Black community, because I think we've not done too bad in some Asian communities in some parts of the country. We've been hopeless in the Black community. And I've been thinking a lot about this and talking to people like Roderick Lynch, the chair of a Liberal Democrat campaign for racial equality. And I think we've got to reach out, as I and other people have done, to build those teams into the Black community. And interestingly, if you look at where the Black community meet and organize, quite a significant group of the Black community organize in churches. Now, that may be controversial for some, but actually, I found going to the mosque, going to the Gurdwara, going to churches for the Korean people locally, that's won me some trust by reaching out, by going to where they are.
Thank you, Ed.
And I think that we should do with the Black community.
Thank you. Okay, so before we move on to section 3, I'm going to very quickly go to Jennifer Gray and see if we've got any other comments or tweets that we'd like to shout out, and then we'll move to the quickfire round.
Thank you. Yeah, so interesting that we were talking about young Liberals there, because this one did amuse me. It's a funny one, I shall say up front. I'd cut the young Liberals first and redouble the efforts to attract the most maligned demographic, the boomers. That comes from Terry, and was followed by many lols, shall I say. So no, good one, Terry. Structuring campaigns is important, but boy, oh boy, do we use reviews as a way for avoiding tackling the real issues. That came from Stephen. Dr. David Nicol, so you were quite right, that was who the question came from earlier on COVID. He thanked you very much for both for answering his question on COVID-19. We're certainly very proud to have him in our region. Josh mentioned the electoral review and talked about the importance of diversity, something that you know, there's definitely clear support for. There were a number of comments in favour and for and against the candidate's performance in the media. Right, what else did we have? So Easy also said, I will vote for the person who will get PR introduced into this country. Number of comments about engaging with other parties as well, and questions around how that will work. And I'm going to end on this one. Matt, who's not from West Midlands, says, I'm not from here, but you seem to have better hosts. We can take that, can't we? I like that, don't we, Nikki? So thank you.
I'm going to put that on the wall. Thanks, Jennifer. So for the final quickfire round, we just thought that we would like to do something a little bit different. This is going to potentially challenge you both in terms of brevity of response, but we're going to be doing a quickfire round. And the way that this will work is that I'll go from one candidate to the other candidate with two choices. Ideally, if you could pick one, and then we'll move on, and let's see how many we can get through over the next couple of minutes.
I hate these.
That's a shame, Ed, because we are going to be starting with you. So, first one, rugby or football?
Rugby.
Football.
Layla, custard creams or bourbons?
Bourbons.
Ed, spicy or plain?
Spicy.
And Layla, sweet or savoury?
Sweet.
Ed, skiing or surfing?
Surfing, I guess.
And then Layla, history or geography?
Geography.
Ed, maths or English?
English.
Layla, up with the lark or a night owl?
Night owl.
Ed, Monopoly or Trivial Pursuit?
Trivial Pursuit.
Layla, tea or coffee?
Tea.
Ed, film or book?
Film.
And then Layla, TED Talk or podcast?
Podcast. Huge fan of podcasts.
And Ed, EastEnders or Coronation Street?
Coronation Street.
And Layla, classical music or commercial music?
All music.
Ed, fiction books or non-fiction books?
Probably non-fiction, if I'm truthful. Non-fiction.
And Layla, Coke or Pepsi?
Coke.
Ed, newspapers or digital print?
Oh, newspapers.
And Layla, hip hop or R&B?
Both.
And Ed, beaches or city breaks?
With my kids, beaches. With my wife, city breaks.
And Layla, final one, Aldi or Lidl?
Aldi.
Aldi.
The house.
Okay, so that's the end of the quick fire round, and what we'll do is we will have final 2-minute summations from each of the candidates. Now, originally we started with Ed, and so Layla, we'll begin with you on your closing statement. Please try to keep these to about 2 or 3 minutes. I will be using the bell.
Oh, brilliant. Well, first of all, Nuki, Jennifer, I really enjoyed this. Thank you, especially to Jennifer, for taking up all the comments. That was a new feature of these hustings. We've done a lot now, and it was a really innovative feature. And Nuki, thank you for so expertly chairing. Now more than ever, we need a strong Liberal vision to challenge the Conservatives and move our country forward. And if Lib Dems aren't stepping up and getting noticed, carving out that distinct space for us against Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer, then who else is going to make the case for a fairer, greener, more compassionate society that's driven from the bottom up? And who else is going to champion small businesses and prioritize tackling discrimination in all of its forms. And who else is going to bring decision-making closer to people by radically decentralizing power from Westminster? Because to change our country, we as a party need to change too. And we've got to build our strength as a party and push forward from the mistakes of the past. Steady as she goes won't cut it anymore. We can't hope that by doing the same thing over again, it's going to change the outcome. We simply cannot risk dropping any lower than our already single-figure polling. With the right strategy, message, and leader, I know we can do better. I know we can rebuild our council base and become that strong political force. Now, my campaigning vision of education, the environment, and the economy, it's been informed by voters, but also activists. And it's already getting serious cut through in every part of the UK. And we need to rebuild trust again. So we can start winning again across the country from the grassroots, inspiring current activists, recruiting new ones, winning council seat after council seat, winning whole councils, so that people can see on the ground why it makes a difference to vote Lib Dem. Because when you vote Lib Dem, you get Lib Dems. And when you get Lib Dems get stuff done. Electing me as our leader sends a clear signal to voters that we've moved on, that we understand that we haven't been getting it right, and that we are going to stand up for them. We need to reinvigorate our party, hold the government to account, and have a leader that voters can believe in. I am that leader. So in this leadership election, please vote for me and let's move forward together. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Layla. And over to Ed for your closing summation.
Well, thank you for all your questions, and thank you to Nuki and to Jennifer for their amazing sharing and aiding. It's really good. Tonight, friends, I hope I've shown you that I have the vision, experience, and judgment to lead the Liberal Democrats. Together, we must tackle the huge challenges we face across our country and inside the Liberal Democrats. I want to work with you, build a team, so we can build an economy where we invest in green jobs, build a fairer society by investing in education and housing, and give carers a much better deal. The Thornhill review of the general election shows us there are no quick fixes to our party's challenges. But I know that by building firm foundations, we can shape a message, build a party machine that speaks to every region across England again, and involves every region, and is bottom up, and is that localist devolution party that we have always been and always must be. I've been touched by how many great West Midlands campaigners are supporting me. Councillor John Hunt, our group leader on Birmingham City Council. Councillor Laura McCarthy, deputy group leader on Solihull Council and general election candidate in Meriden. Phil Benyon, the former MEP for the West Midlands. John Hemming, the excellent former MP for Birmingham Yardley. Councillor Fran Aborski, our deputy leader on Wyre Districts. Adi Adeyemo, our leader on Solihull and our 2019 general election candidate for Solihull. Dominic Skinner, our superb PPC for Stratford-on-Avon. I'm grateful to them all for their support and the support of so many others. Together, my friends, let's campaign our socks off. As leader, I want to build the party as a strong, independent party. Yes, I want to defeat this awful Tory government. And yes, I consider informal understandings with Labour to do that. But I will keep the Labour Party at arm's length. No pacts, no joint campaigning forces. In many places, people still need us to take on Labour. So please join the likes of Shirley Williams and Daisy Cooper to back me as leader, to lead winning campaigns for a greener economy, a fairer society, and a more caring country. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. I would just like to close out today's session. We are finishing slightly early, but I don't think anybody will necessarily complain, to say that we had a fantastic range of questions submitted. We had questions on affordable housing raised by Ben. We had questions around LGBT+ issues. We had questions around how the candidates would take forward, if they were elected, any of those who were opponents during this campaign. Unfortunately, we did not have time to ask all of the questions that we had submitted, but I do want to say to those at home that we will be passing on every question that we received to the candidates' teams. Hopefully, potentially, any candidate will be able to follow up with you following the event. Aside from that, I'd like to thank both of the candidates so much for taking the time this evening to make their case for leader to the West Midlands region. As I'm sure everyone will agree, it's been insightful hearing your views and perspectives on such a broad range of issues. I'd also like to thank the members for providing great questions, for engaging in the debate online and on YouTube, and hopefully using our hashtag #WMLibDems. Now, in a physical hustings, it would be about this time that we would send around a bucket to collect donations from the members in the hall.
Or sell raffle tickets.
Or sell raffle tickets, exactly. Now, we will always, as a region, be happy to receive donations. However, in lieu of that, I'd also like to mention that today is Black Pound Day, and it's officially being supported by councillors in the West Midlands region and formerly by Birmingham City Council. So we encourage you to end the evening by doing some light retail therapy with Black-owned businesses. And if you would like any suggestions, we will be tweeting out the details from the @WLibDems Twitter account. Aside from that, I want to wish everybody a fantastic evening. We hope you've enjoyed the hustings. If you have any feedback, please do get in touch. Aside from that, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.